But I didn't have my family early on. The way you get the family is by reading. And really that's, I think, you know, to me it's not so you think you can write, so you think you can read. Reading was really a challenge. And when I went away to school finally, I could read basically anything. I could read novels, I could read philosophy, I love studying film, but poetry was a difficult language for me. Poetry was a difficult language. And I felt, this feels impossible for me. And so I said, well, okay, that's how I'll spend my life. That feels worthy of a lifetime. So I was very lucky because early on I found two poets who helped me. I won't say saved me, but I used to say saved me, but you know, I realized they were just there, they were there at the right time. And the first one was a poet named Rainer Maria Rilke. I'm sure many of you know his work, and Rilke was incredibly important to me, and he has the very famous poem, The Archaic Torso of Apollo, which I see heads nodding. I know you know that poem. Rilke, when he was looking at this almost destroyed sculpture of Apollo, and all that's left is the torso, and he talks about the torso as radiant, and the torso basically says to him at the end of the poem, you must change your life. And I thought, okay. But for me, Rilke, I think, meant you must change it once and for good. I've had to change it like every 15 minutes. You know? But he was really important to me. I also read a novel. It's a really thinly disguised novel. If you read his diaries and his notebooks, there's really not much difference between that and this novel. It's pretty thinly disguised. Maybe that's how poets do it. But in it, he said, actually, I'm going to read it. This is from the notebooks of Montelori's Brugge, and I read this early on. It was really important to me that I read this, I think. And he wrote it, he sort of buried it in this novel, but I think it's really a kind of, not just an ars poetica, but a manifesto for living. And it was great advice, because really what he was talking about was, you know, just go slow. He has that great phrase that you've heard where Rilke says you must live with questions. You know, when you're young, I had so many questions. I wanted the answers, and I wanted the answers right now. And Rilke has that great phrase, you must live your life right through the questions. And of course, you know, once you get a question answered, then there's another question right behind it. So it's just that series of doors. Alas, those verses one writes in youth aren't much. One should wait and gather sweetness and light all his life, a long one if possible, and then maybe at the end he might write 10 good lines. Now, Rilke wrote just a lot more than 10 good lines. Maybe at the end he might write 10 good lines. For poetry isn't, as people imagine, merely feelings. It's experiences. To write one line, a man and a woman ought to see many cities, people, and things. He must learn to know animals and the way of birds in the air, and how little flowers open in the morning. One must be able to think back to unknown places, to partings long foreseen, to days of childhood and to parents, to days on the sea, to nights of travel. One must have memories of many nights of love, no two alike. And the screams of women in childbed. One must have sat by the dying. One must have sat by the dead in a room with the windows open. But it's not enough to have memories. One must be able to forget them and have vast patience until they come again, when they become blood within us and glances and gestures. Then, first, it can happen that in a rare hour, the first word of a verse may arise and come forth. And so I was asked to read some of my early poems, and I thought I'd read the first poem that I ever really remember thinking, that's a poem, I think. And I've written so many of them, I mean, just all through my teenage years and 20s. And it's the first book, the first poem in this book. It was the first one where I thought, I think that's a poem. I still think it's a poem, actually. Years later, I still would agree with myself. The poem is called The Bell, and it's the first poem in the Blessing, which was the first poem in the Country of Air. I should tell you also, I'll talk about it in a minute, but this large cinder block book is actually 6 different books that have been brought together under one cover. The Bell. In the tower, the bell is alone, like a man in his room, thinking and thinking. The bell is made of iron. It takes the weight of a man to make the bell move. Far below, the bell feels hands on a rope. It considers this. It turns its head. Miles away, a man in his room hears the clear sound and lifts his head to listen. And for years with this poem, I thought it was about communication and breaking out of that solipsistic self that I felt trapped into as a young man, and that would have driven me crazy if I hadn't found a way out of it. And I thought that for years and years and years, but I've come and everything is hindsight. I know nothing, and I really know that I know nothing, but if I turn around and look back, I'll say, oh, I can see how I got here and there. And I think it's really about that distance from here to here that the poem's about. That you're hearing something and letting it move you, letting it resonate inside your chest, and then it comes back out. So communication isn't just inward and outward, but it also has to do with that interior space. Well, the thing about Rilke, who I loved, and I loved everything he wrote, I never tried to write Lincoln's books, by the way. I'm talking about influences. I'm not really very interested in influences. I was interested in companions. I wanted friends. And Rilke was a really good friend, but I couldn't have him as my only best friend. Because Rilke, if I would model myself on Rilke, I think Rilke is much more grounded than people give him credit for being, but we often think of Rilke as being up in the castle, sort of the ultimate off by himself poet. I think it's really unfair, but I thought that one too. And I definitely knew that, if I had a countess or a princess that wanted me to come to her castle and write my poems, I would have packed my bags and gone and stayed there forever. I would have been that hermit. But I found another poet that I loved equally, sometimes more. When I first started writing, I didn't want to be the poet that I turned out to be. The poet that I wanted to be long, long ago was a communist, radical, revolutionary, black beret, cigarette smoking, whiskey swilling, blow-up-the-world poet. And I learned the Caravan poem. I got an email a couple weeks ago from a woman in Wisconsin who told me she was in her 90s. She said, I like gypsies too. Do they really come to Wisconsin? Next time they come, I just would love to meet them. That world that we can go to of imagination really needed to be grounded by a poet named Nazim Hikmet. He was a Turkish poet, and some of you may know about him. He was really a child prodigy, and Hikmet was indeed a communist poet, a lifelong communist poet, and that was one of the reasons I loved him. He was from Turkey. Turkey had a very severe right-wing regime, and unlike the United States, people actually read poetry in Turkey, and young soldiers were reading his poems, and this was discovered, and Hikmet was rounded up and put in jail, and that's where he spent the vast majority of his adult life. Which sounds like a terrible end to a poet, that Hikmet, and as I was coming along and reading American poets, which I could not resonate, and the poets a couple of generations ahead of me, God bless them, have come around, but at the time of writing, I thought very self-involved poems, very self-pitying poems. And then I would think about Hikmet, who wrote in a jail cell, much bigger than where I'm standing. It certainly doesn't exist stage. And there were these unbridled poems that just could not be imprisoned. They just could not be held back. They were full of joy. They were full of love. And I thought, why am I feeling self-assisted and feeling self-pity? This makes no sense. So Hikmet was really crucial to me. And I thought that I would read a poem by him, a poem that actually became the epigraph to my first book, Country There, the last lines. The poem's called On Living.